Welcome to What Matters Now, the Times of Israel's weekly deep dive into one issue facing Israel right now. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan. This week, I speak with Hebrew University in Jerusalem professor Aron Troen for a deep dive into two powerful issues facing him since October 7th. One draws upon his professional expertise. Troen is a professor of nutrition science and public health. His most recent research is dealing with whether or not there's a state of famine in the Gaza Strip during this war that Hamas launched on October 7th with the massacre of some 1,200 mostly civilians in southern Israel. But Troen is also an Israeli who was personally affected by the Hamas onslaught, and among those killed on October 7th were his sister and her husband, who were murdered in their home on Kibbutz Holit, leaving 3 children, Troen's nieces and nephews, orphans. His nephew, who survived the murders of his parents in his bedroom, now lives with Troen. We discuss in depth Troen's professional work and how he and his team dispelled reports of a famine. And in the second part of our lengthy interview, we talk about his sister and how he and her children still believe we can work for a day in which Palestinian and Israeli people can live side by side. So this week, we ask Professor Aron Troen, what matters now? Aron, thank you so much for joining me in our Jerusalem offices.
Thank you for inviting me, Amanda.
It is such a pleasure. We have a lot to discuss, but I'd like you first to describe who you are and what you do in terms of your research field.
My name is Aron Troen. I'm a professor of nutrition science and public health at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the Faculty of Agriculture, Food and Environment. My basic research deals with metabolic processes that rely on nutrition in order to support brain function. And so they tie our nutritional status to human well-being and welfare across the life spectrum, from early childhood and through old age. If one believes that nutrition is important for brain function, and our brains are important to our well-being, then one can ask the question, what happens if people do not have adequate nutrition due to varying circumstances? And that has led me to be heavily involved in issues of food security or food insecurity in Israel. I advise the National Nutritional Security Council on evidence-based policy development, and we try to think about how we can best deliver nutrition in order to support the public.
Okay, and this is what you've been doing for decades, shall we say, but recently you've also turned your gaze onto Gaza and what's happening in terms of food security, insecurity, and even famine there. There have been accusations of genocide. Israel is, of course, in the international courts right now trying to defend itself against these accusations brought by South Africa and other states that have partnered up with South Africa. And one of these accusations is the manufacturing of famine in the Gaza Strip. And there are many different ways of looking at this. And one of the ways that you and a team of other researchers looked at this was to break down the amount of aid that was going into the Strip, not necessarily being distributed properly, but going into the Strip, and calorically see how each individual would fare with the amount of food that was being brought in. Can you, first of all, tell me what was your impetus in this project? Why did you participate in this?
Well, let me take a step back. In March, end of March of this year, a UN process called the International Phase Classification published a report. I'll explain what this organization is in a moment. But the International Phase Classification, otherwise known as the IPC, published a report claiming that there was possibility of famine in the north of Gaza and severe food insecurity of catastrophic proportions throughout the Gaza Strip. And as a public health professional, that was very concerning to me, as it was indeed to most of my colleagues in the Israeli public health community and to my colleagues on the Academic Advisory Committee of the National Nutritional Security Council. And much as we, as citizens, try to bring our professional expertise to bear on important issues, the discourse and conversation were, what do we do about this? This is a very serious allegation. Israel has absolutely no interest in seeing a famine erupt on its borders, neither morally nor instrumentally from a strategic perspective. It doesn't serve our interest. And there are, of course, other kinds of perspectives on this which have to do with the obligations that Israel has as a party to a war under international law. All of these types of questions are very serious. They require a certain level of sophistication, nuance, and professional understanding in order to assess the reality of what is going on. And in the fog of war, it is very hard to obtain data. And in such a highly politicized environment and conflict, where propaganda is a major part of the war, where the use of human shields and the callous disregard for the Palestinian civilian well-being by the Hamas is such a major part of the fight, and where there is such hostility towards Israel innately in some quarters, it makes it very hard to have a reasoned and clear conversation about what is going on and what should be done about it. In fact, we had an emergency meeting informally of the members of the Academic Advisory Committee, and we set it for the following day. There was a flurry of WhatsApps. What should we do? Should we talk? So we gathered to discuss, and it turned out I was the only one who had actually read the report out of the 15 people who were on this call. And what I read in the report was concerning, both because of the severity of the allegations, but also because of what appeared to be both a biased approach in writing it. For example, it describes the background to the hostilities as the hostilities began on October 7th with a massive bombardment by Israel of Gaza. Hamas was not mentioned once. Hostages were not mentioned once. The most recent report came out repeating these types of tendencies, saying that we attacked the refugee camp of Nusrat and killed 247 people, failing to mention that we were rescuing hostages who had been held captive in civilian homes in a densely populated area. So there are ways in which, as an Israeli, I find the framing of the discussion troubling. But as a scientist, I find it even more concerning that there are methodological flaws, lack of transparency in the data that is presented, and attempt or gaps between what the data that the report shows and the projections and inferences that are made on the basis of the data.
You were talking about March, and if I'm not mistaken, in that report, it had projected that by May, there would be famine conditions in northern Gaza. And then in May, the head of the World Food Program said that there was indeed a full-blown famine in northern Gaza. And it appears to me that among these methodological holes that you're referring to, is this ability to even project that, let alone the ability to report it. Is that correct?
Well, Let me explain a little bit about the IPC. It's an organizational structure that exists within the framework of the United Nations and global humanitarian organizations. It's a process that was set up a few decades ago in order to sound the alarm when crises and catastrophes, whether man-made or natural, threatened to produce famine, because once a famine has set in and people are so severely malnourished that they are dying of hunger, which is a lay definition of famine. There are actually criteria that are used to classify the severity of the conditions on the ground, and that's part of what this process tries to do. Once famine sets in, then the deaths continue because you cannot immediately provide the relief needed, not logistically in terms of delivering food to the population, and not biologically in terms of overcoming the severe malnourishment and the impact of that malnourishment on people's health.
So you need to stave off famine.
So you need to stave off famine, and famine is recognized in political discourse and in global public health largely as being a political issue. Amartya Sen won the Nobel Prize for showing that famines in Bangladesh and other places were not because of lack of available food, but because of lack of what he called entitlements, people's ability to access the food through socially acceptable ways. In other words, by purchase with money rather than, say, selling your body or being able to have the means of obtaining the necessary food. And those are seen as social and political failures. There still tends to be a tendency in some circles to, and often perhaps for good reason, to blame political processes for catastrophes. There's no question that when there's a war, it's a failure of politics to achieve people's ends by peacefully. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all wars are unjustified or that all politicians are evil.
Or that there necessarily has to be a famine during a war if there's available food product.
Right. So the IPC was set up in order to create early warning and then to allow decision makers to receive consensus so that they have the political backing to raise the money and make the donations to the organizations that actually, humanitarian organizations that deliver the food on the ground. Major organizations like the World Food Program, you mentioned the WFP, are responsible within the United Nations structure for delivering that emergency food aid. And in fact, the WFP in 2020, I think, during COVID, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their interventions to deliver food aid in humanitarian crisis situations. There are other organizations that are part of this, for example, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, UNICEF for children, and so on and so forth, plus large non-governmental humanitarian organizations like Oxfam and others. UNRWA is part of this umbrella, and within the umbrella there are different clusters that aggregate organizations that have special expertise. For example, UNICEF leads the nutrition cluster, which is really in charge of women, infants, and children. So they'll be the professional body required to, or tasked with, ensuring that baby formula is delivered to infants in the case of hostilities. The World Food Program is in charge of the food security cluster, which then is supposed to coordinate the donations of food and make sure that they are delivered to the population in a conflict, or the term is conflict-affected populations, CAPS, in the zone. And World Health Organization is in charge for medical care and hygiene and so on and so forth. The Palestinian situation is unique partly because of UNRWA. UNRWA, which was established in 1949 specifically for Palestinian refugees, has by many accounts perpetuated Palestinian refugeehood and victimhood. And the emphasis on providing aid has, some would argue, limited Palestinian agency and impeded the emphasis on taking the billions of dollars of aid that have flowed into Gaza and the West Bank in over the past years, and putting them to good humanitarian and development use of civil society rather than, say, building tunnels and rockets, and not protecting the civilian population. And these organizations feed up, in the moment of crisis, data that are used to create an assessment once the IPC is activated. So if there is concern of famine, then the IPC can be activated, and the working groups on the ground are supposed to relay their information to an expert committee called the Famine Review Committee, which evaluates the reports, maybe asks questions, and then determines whether or not the classification that the lower levels are proposing is in fact the situation. And they make a projection and issue recommendations, which are often extreme worst case scenarios, because their goal is to sound an alarm and mobilize leaders of the international community to intervene and provide at least food aid and money, if not intervene on a political strategic agenda, which would be, say, as they called for in these reports, an immediate ceasefire. Not necessarily calling for release of hostages for humanitarian aid, but an immediate ceasefire to provide food for the Palestinian population. And because organizations like UNRWA and the other organizations on the ground are largely populated by Palestinian locals, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a bias in the data coming out, but some of the data has been called into question, such as those reports which are cited in the IPC report as coming from the Ministry of Health of the State of Palestine.
The Hamas-run Ministry of Health of the non-state of Palestine.
Correct. So it's not unreasonable to look at this report and say, well, how far does it take us in understanding what is actually going on the ground, given that we have very limited access to real data, and given that I certainly would be cautious about denying what is absolutely evident, which is that Palestinian civilians are suffering tremendously.
There's no doubt that the Palestinian civilians in Gaza are suffering. It is very clear that under the conditions that they must live in right now, it is suffering. But the question that you were raising and your teammates, whether this is famine, has not really been resolved in terms of these organizations that you're describing.
Well, I think it's been pretty well resolved that there is no famine. In fact, the report in May came back saying, contrary to what the Cindy McCain, the head of the World Food Program, said, and contrary to what FuseNet, which is another organization that is funded by the USAID, although it's not directly run by the U.S. administration, is said about there's a famine occurring now, the data don't support it, despite the projections in the report. So if you look at what constitutes a famine, there are subjective survey questions, which are run in this instance by a Palestinian polling company. There are a handful of people in north, central, and southern Gaza who are randomly selected by telephone to answer the questions, similar to the household food security questionnaire. There are other tools which are used in these situations to try to determine on a subjective, self-reported basis whether people have adequate access to food. These three tools are inconsistent with each other. So the report says, well, we looked at whether or not the data converge, and the most severe categories repeat in all three all three survey tools. I don't remember the numbers precisely, but it was something like 11 or 12% convergence on the most severe category on all three tools. But if you look at the divergence, it's 18%. So, in fact, some of the tools indicate that if you use the consensus criteria that the IPC handbook stipulates, they should be classified as phase 1 or 2, which is secure or moderate insecurity, and they go on to classify them as being severe. So there's an inconsistency in the use of the data. There's an inconsistency in the trends. The sample size is very, very small, and it's not unreasonable to wonder about the validity of the self-reported data. There are other data that have to do with anthropometric measurements of children, the circumference of the middle upper arm. When they are below a certain percentile, they are considered to indicate acute malnourishment. They have different organizations that have made these measurements in children who are being brought in for vaccination. These are not representative samples of the general population. In fact, it's hard to know how any data can be representative right now. And those data actually show that the situation is stable. There was a slight increase in the early months of the war, and the numbers are back down to baseline, which don't indicate famine at all. The death rate is an important consideration for famine. If people are dying of hunger, you have a certain excess death rate beyond natural causes or violent causes of death. And there's a metric for that, which is, I think, 2 deaths per 10,000 population. The actual numbers that they themselves report are 0.55 deaths per 10,000 population. They're far below the rate that you would expect if you have famine, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole variety of metrics that, based on the data that they report, the trends which show that even though they projected over 1 million people being in famine in the worst state and actually dying of hunger, the numbers recently dropped down, that 770,000 people less than they projected at being in severe phase 5 catastrophic state. Once again, this doesn't mean that there isn't a very severe problem, humanitarian crisis. But the reports, and here I come back to the question you asked on genocide. The report has been misconstrued. Projections are reported by the media and, in fact, by politicians as being the current state of affair and factual.
Right, and even
not an estimate.
After everything that you've just said about the initial report being revised and republished, the headlines are still there. If you look online today, do a Google search, famine in Gaza, and hit the news button, you can find headlines from this month, this week, even probably today, saying that there is famine in Gaza. So how do you square that circle?
You can look, I looked when this came out at the initial report, which was published by Reuters, a wire news service, citing the executive summary of the IPC report, or the press statement that they issued. They actually have a whole press policy because they know that they deal with controversial issues. And the report said there's a high likelihood of possible famine in northern Gaza, not in all of Gaza. And that was picked up by large newspaper outlets, and they made their statements saying there is famine in Gaza. And then rapidly you see reports that say that Israel is deliberately starving Palestinians. The claims of genocide have a history. They go back years. In 2005, when I was at Tufts University, these claims were being circulated that Israel was deliberately starving Gaza. This is before Hamas came to power.
This is before or after the disengagement?
Before the disengagement, 2005.
Right. August 2005, disengagement.
Yes, before the August 2005 disengagement. I was at Tufts University, and there was discussion there because people in this community are concerned with well-being, irrespective of race, creed, politics. I mean, we really want to make sure the world is a better place. That's why we get into this business. And some of my colleagues said, no, we really have to go out and protest. And I said, look, we're scientists. Let's see if we can figure out a constructive way to examine the situation and then make some real recommendations on ways in which to strengthen and enhance people's food security and welfare, well-being and health. And we created brought together a international conference. The lead partners were Tufts University and Ben Gurion University and Al-Quds University. And then there were other participants from around the world. It was actually harder to get the Palestinians from the Ministry of Health in Gaza and the Ministry of Health in Ramallah to talk to each other than it was for the rest of us to talk to each other, or for them to talk to us individually. But it was a very successful meeting, and we all sat down together and spaghetti in Beersheba and had pasta for dinner and met at my parents' home. I grew up in the Negev, and we hosted them personally, and it was a remarkable event. We published a report. We tried to do some follow-up research, which wound up being scuttled by the Palestinian side saying, we really don't want to have Israel on the ground, and we really don't want to cooperate. So unfortunately, that was where things died in terms of the partnership. But the program that we wrote up in terms of the research was followed up with between the Palestinians and other humanitarian organizations, CARE, Catholic Aid Relief. And as a result, the micronutrient deficiency issue was sorted out in Palestine so that they have fortified flour fortified with folic acid and iron and other vitamins, and salt that has iodine, which is manufactured, by the way, in Israel for the Palestinian Authority. And Israel, we haven't been able to get this legislation through our own Ministry of Health. So in Israel, we have micronutrient deficiencies that would be preventable with a simple measure that the Palestinians run through. So the meeting had some impact and demonstrated that you really can cooperate on issues of common interest in public health if you want. But around that time, because of that involvement, I was called upon in the mid-2010s, the mid-teens, to look at further allegations that Israel was starving the Palestinians. And we looked at some of the data, which are comparative data on acute malnutrition and growth rates in Israeli, Palestinian infants and infants from around the Middle East. And the data clearly showed that Haredis had higher rates of stunted growth than Palestinians, and that Jordanians and Egyptians and Saudi Arabians, not a poor country, had higher rates than in Gaza. So the data didn't show what was being alleged. And unfortunately, I think that in this present war, Israel acted mindlessly in playing into what has clearly been part of the Palestinian strategy of using human shields and magnifying the civilian population suffering in order to portray Israel as evil and to isolate it diplomatically and gain sympathy and support in the West. And it's very unfortunate, but that seems to be what has happened here. There was no question early on in the war that humanitarian issues would be a problem. Israeli politicians made deplorable statements very early on in the heat of the fury and trauma of the massacre on October 7th.
And continue to do so even a week or two ago.
Some, unfortunately, continue to do so. Gallant said we should starve Gaza, and Giora Island made similar statements. He had been the former head of the National Security Council, a general. And clearly that is not viable, is unacceptable, would be immoral. Although there are other questions of morality of how you deal with humanitarian aid and whether it prolongs the conflict or really achieves its goal is another question which is worth discussing. But at the time, it very quickly became apparent that this was not going to be Israeli policy. It wasn't going to be because the government understood very quickly that this was wrong-headed and contrary to our interests. The United States put an enormous amount of pressure on us very quickly. On October 15th, David Satterfield, a very, very accomplished and seasoned diplomat, was appointed as the United States President's special envoy to the Middle East for humanitarian affairs. And on October 23rd, I only have documentation of Biden and Netanyahu's phone call readout, where Biden says in no uncertain terms that we must maintain unfettered humanitarian assistance to Gaza. And so this was recognized very early on. However, I'll go back to the international agencies. The responsibility for providing humanitarian aid is not Israel's. We aren't obligated to feed our neighbors, as nice as it would be to do so. Certainly not in the time of war. But we are obligated to prevent starvation of civilians, and the responsibility to do so, to provide a civil administration for occupied populations, is only when you occupy legally in international law, only when you are the occupying power and you control the territory. Israel does not occupy Gaza, hasn't occupied Gaza. There are those from 2005 who said, yes, Israel, certainly 2007, Israel imposed a siege on Gaza and has occupied them and is trying to starve them into submission. So that's where some of these claims come from. But that is highly debatable. And since we don't have a civil administration, and since we don't have the mechanisms to supply Gaza with humanitarian aid set up, and since we were taken by surprise, we didn't start the war, we didn't plan it, we didn't initiate, so we didn't plan for providing for the needs of an enemy population during fierce and dangerous combat operations with a heavily enmeshed civilian and terrorist populations that are intertwined and difficult to set apart. So we were caught unawares without having a plan in place to figure out how we could prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. And I think it wasn't a surprise that this might emerge, which is why you see the American pressure. And Israel's response had been to say, we will provide the official policy responses. We will allow any food and humanitarian aid to go into Gaza. And the agency responsible for doing that is COGAT, the coordinator of the government affairs in the territories, who are responsible for this type of civilian administration. But the fact that you have a label and a name doesn't mean you have the personnel who are expert in food, logistics, trucking, cold chains, supply chains, and all the rest of it, or even assessing, well, how much food do people need? Not a trivial issue at all. And in fact, most of my work is on domestic food insecurity and welfare issues and nutritional requirements, but certainly not on humanitarian crisis management. We have a colleague who's a member of this working paper, Dorit Nitzan, who's a professor of public health and emergency food assistance at Ben-Gurion University. She's a pediatrician by training. She used to head the Israel Ministry of Health Nutrition Division. And in recent years, she worked for the WHO in charge of their emergency response in Europe. So she was in charge of delivering food to the Ukraine after the Russian invasion, or for dealing with the health and medical side of things, but very much involved in that UN cluster structure that I spoke of, and indeed for the Kurds in the north of Syria. So she's no stranger to these issues and the challenges that one faces in the heat of conflict and in the fog of war, trying to figure out how you deal with providing food in contentious, politicized and inflammatory situations where the humanitarian issue is going to be leveraged by the terrorist entities in ways which are not consistent with the rules of the game as we know them, and put those who want to play by the rules of the game at a severe disadvantage. So with that, when the claims came out of saying genocide, we said, can we do something fact-based? Can we actually try to get a handle? I'm not going to take at face value what Israel is saying. I'm not going to take at face value what the Palestinians are saying. I just want to see what are the data available that can give us an indication of the severity of the situation and which are an actionable item, so that if, in fact, the war of words between the New York Times and the Times of Israel on whether or not Israel is deliberately starving the Palestinians and not obstructing the number of trucks going in. Trucks don't tell you what the food on the trucks is. Trucks don't really give you a measure of adequacy. You can throw out, they need 500 trucks a day. Well, who said? I actually spent some time trying to get the World Food Program to explain to me where they get those numbers from, and nobody could give me an answer. I may not have found the right person. I'm sure someone there has a key. And a calculation, but we were had to resort to doing our own. So we turned to Kogat and said, listen, can you give us the list of all the trucks entering Gaza? Because as I said, Kogat says we're not responsible for the providing of any donated food. The UN can do that. Arab states can do that. Humanitarian agencies, the Arab Red Crescent, anyone who wants to give food for humanitarian assistance, we will help it get in, provided it goes through a security check. I mean, the Jordanian army did airdrops along with the British and the US and other armies. The UAE supplied food. There was no restriction placed on the ability to bring in food, and we wanted the registry. And it took time for all these papers to be turned into a computerized system, a big Excel sheet that Kogat maintained. But from December, the end of December onwards, there's been a registry of every truck that goes in, what its manifest includes, and what the weight of the goods are. And having the weight and the identity of the food items allows one to calculate the nutrition value. Just like you can ask on a personal dietary basis, okay, if you eat a hamburger, that's 200 grams, what are you getting out of your hamburger? And if you eat apples, what do you get out of an apple? And you can create an estimate, and you can account for food wastage and loss along the way, and the packages and the parcels. There are a lot of humanitarian organizations bring in standardized food parcels, and so we obtained the content of those parcels, how many cans of beans, how many liters of oil, and kilos of sugar and flour, and so on. And then there are large commodities, 15 tons of flour, of enriched flour, provided by the World Food Program. So you can add this up, and we summed up what was going in on every shipment every day throughout the war. We published a working paper early on, and that was an attempt to try to get feedback. We submitted it for peer review, and we've had additional feedback. Most of the feedback was on the political framing and political questions. The methodology that we have used was deemed sound, and we now are resubmitting or finishing the revision and resubmitting our final paper, which goes from January to July. When you look at the food coming in, the actual supply of food entering Gaza is more than adequate and above the humanitarian standards that are known as the sphere criteria, which require 2,100 kilocalories per person per day. The average over time is around 3,000 kilocalories per person per day. Up till May, it was 3,400, which would rank Gaza in the upper quintile, the upper 20% of national food supplies globally out of 187 states, based on the ranking of Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. Over time, there's been some decrease in the caloric content, although the actual amount of food going in has remained remarkably consistent from May onwards, despite the fighting in Rafah and in the southern part of the Gaza Strip, in response of which, we're talking about the Philadelphia corridor now in the negotiations on the ceasefire with Hamas, and Egypt does not want Israeli presence there, so they shut down the crossing from Rafah, which of course has limited the amount of food coming in.
In fact, this week I read on the Relief Web, I'm sure you know about this, that's put out by OSHA, that there's been an increase in food entry and of commercial food cargo.
Correct.
But the question is, what happens once it gets in? It's not only that it's allowed to get in, which is, of course, Israel's job, but does it actually get to the people?
Well, there are certainly questions as to whether or not the food gets to the people. But let me finish before we get to the issues of distribution, because we said availability is only one pillar of food security. You need access, you need stability and use. But the overall analysis says, listen, there is enough food being brought in. It is the responsibility of the donors to coordinate the food. It's the responsibility of the donors in the food security cluster to figure out what they want to get and what quality of food needs to be distributed. And in fact, the list includes a whole variety of organizations which are not monitored by the UN. United Arab Emirates, Jordan, other states like Japan has an aid agency which brings in a small amount of food. Certainly organizations like the Red Crescent, and you just mentioned the private sector. None of that is charted in the UN report. So when the UN says not enough food is getting in, they're not counting a significant proportion of food that actually is being allowed in, both as donations and for commercial purposes. There's actually an enormous amount of coordination. Every day at 8 p.m., the UN, the EU, the Americans, the Egyptians, and COGAT sit down together in a room and go over the daily lists. So this isn't being done without the knowledge of the UN agencies, and yet for political reasons, I think there's a conflation of the political pressure which is put on Israel to try to counteract the right-wing and extreme side of the government, and to try to maintain pressure on Israel to do the right thing, which I think the people in charge of actually getting the food across, the army, the civil servants, the people who enact policy, who have the operational responsibility, are doing anyway. That is conflated with the people who are saying and castigating Israel and weaponizing these claims for nefarious purposes. And it limits the ability to actually cooperate. And this is without talking about other problems that the humanitarian sector has and humanitarian dilemmas, where the humanitarian sector says we don't want to cooperate overtly, or at least not be seen as cooperating, because then we'll be seen as cooperating with the enemy. We will lose credibility and ability to function in Gaza, and we also may put our lives at risk.
The enemy being Israel.
The enemy being Israel, right. Yes. I heard that directly. We had a meeting with people who are members of various humanitarian organizations, a discreet private meeting in Tel Aviv, to try to see how can we make things better. And I was struck by that statement. There was something else that I realized that emerged, which is that, and this is written about in the humanitarian and academic literature, the concept of humanitarian principles of neutrality and impartiality, which derive from the middle of the 19th century in Switzerland and later encoded and enshrined in the Geneva Conventions and this Red Cross embodiment of humanitarian ideals. Mind you, the Red Cross has not come to see our hostages yet or ensure that they have their humanitarian rights protected. But these notions create serious dilemmas which are not only seen in Israel with Gaza. For example, in Somalia, if you want to get food to the population, you need a mechanism. You need someone who can bring it in and deliver it and distribute it safely. And who are those people? The people in power, the warlords. So you work with warlords because you want to make sure that people don't starve.
The ends justify the means, essentially.
Yes, or we close our eyes under the principle of neutrality to the moral hazards of effectively collaborating with Hamas.
Because we should add that Hamas has its tentacles in basically everything. We mentioned the health ministry. We mentioned, of course, UNRWA. There's a high-profile case that we've discussed on different podcasts in which the workers were found by the organization itself, in retrospect, to have been complicit on October 7th in actually even carrying out the attacks on the Israeli population. So what you're saying, it sounds to me, is that these humanitarian organizations that you've been speaking with, they say, hey, we have no other choice but to use the Hamas channels in order to get our food to the people who need it.
Yes. There's been looting. There have been attacks by Hamas on the providers of aid. I went down to Kibbutz Holit recently to my sister's home to help my nieces and nephews pack up and salvage the remains of what wasn't burnt when their house was destroyed and set on fire. And they're just a kilometer or two away from Kerem Shalom. So there was a mortar attack as we were sitting there, and they shut down the crossing. It's a very complicated, nuanced situation that doesn't. We don't do justice if we're trying to say only Israel is creating genocide and the only solution is free Palestine from the river to the sea. I think if there were greater cooperation and trust between the IDF, the United Nations agencies, and the Palestinian civil society, we might be able to come up with an alternative mechanism which would bypass the power of these warlords, the power that Hamas has over the civil population, and their cynical abuse of control of food and other kinds of humanitarian aid in order to maintain their power and hold over the population in Gaza. Some of this is even coming out in Palestinian accounts nowadays because they have suffered enough that, and Hamas has been weakened enough that they're not as afraid of making their voices heard. But I have no way of assessing this in any numerical terms. And also, mind you, it's not a democracy, so the translation of people's attitudes into effective civil mobilization to meet civil needs, societal needs, is not straightforward. And if I would fault Israel and Israeli politics, it's for not talking about the day after, not presenting an obvious solution of what happens when we have freed all the hostages and we've decimated Hamas, and now what? How do we rebuild? We're all going to live here together. No one is going anywhere. And the only way forward is to find a way that we can live side by side. We don't have to love each other, but we certainly shouldn't be bloodying each other.
That is phenomenal to hear from you, of course, who more than many other Israelis has a reason to not want to live side by side with the neighbor that killed his sister and her husband and ruined the lives of their 3 children. And I think it's counterintuitive that you'd be one who would promote having the ability to live side by side, because so many people would feel such hatred towards the people, meaning the nation, in a way that committed such atrocities and aided and abetted in many, many accounts that we've gotten. Certainly when the hostages were brought back, we saw a jubilant population rejoicing, seeing these perhaps even corpses that are being paraded through town squares. But I would like you to, if you don't mind, just tell us a little bit about your sister. And so we have a memory of her in this podcast as well.
I never know where to begin. You can't capture a person by outlining their age and name and professional achievements. And her loss is such a gaping void. But she was a very loving, caring individual. She was a musician, a singer, a devoted mother. She met her husband at the Rimon School of Music. He was also a musician and decided to become a teacher and an educator. They were deeply caring and committed people. If anyone had something going on with them, Deborah would be, she changed her name later to Shaka, but she was born as Debbie. So Debbie or Shaka would be the first person to come over and say, "Are you okay? What's going on?" It came up in the eulogies at the funeral and at the shloshim, where people who knew her and friends would come up and say, I remember my first day in class at the university with this big auditorium and all the intimidating people, and I wasn't sure how I was going to do, and this woman came up to me and said, "Hey, how are you doing? Are you new here? Would you, like to sit by me? Would you?" They, together, Shlomi and Shaka, were very committed to the deeper levels of culture. They both could have been very successful pop artists. They weren't interested in being celebrities. They taught language and values through the words of the poems and the history of the songs and the collective community that writing songs and expressing the deeper elements of our human experience through words and song and music can express. They helped found the Hagar school, a hand-in-hand Hebrew, Arabic, Jewish, Muslim school in Beersheba, and my nieces and nephews, Shaka, Autumn went there. And they believed deeply in human decency, in democracy, in the value of all lives being equal. That didn't mean that they were Pollyanna-ish. That didn't mean that they were naive. They chose to make their home in Holit and be part of the community, a wonderful, vibrant community. And if you see who their neighbors were and the people who were murdered on that day, one by one, people of substance and commitment and values. Chaim Katzman, their neighbor who played with them in the band that they had, was murdered protecting his neighbor. He was a doctor of philosophy and wrote about Jewish-Palestinian coexistence and Palestinian music and you name it. People like Shoshan Haran, who was a graduate of the Faculty of Agriculture where I work and established a humanitarian organization to solve food security for the world, and many, many others. They taught their children, I think that I spoke about this at a speech I gave for the 30th, the Shloshim, in our community in Maskeret Batya. And I think that one of the remarkable testimonies to their living heritage is their children, who refuse to hate, who refuse to do what you didn't intend but alluded to, is in collectively speaking about them, they. Now, I'm not naive. We act in political organizations. I live in Israel because I need to be in a community that expresses my culture and history and future, I hope, as a collective, not simply as an atomic individual. And our societies make decisions collectively and act in ways which support and promote that, hopefully not all oppositional. But the children say, no, they didn't all kill us. They want justice. They would like to see the perpetrators and the people who sent them to be brought to justice. Soon after Autumn came home from the hospital, just a couple of days after the murders, and we're all gathered at my parents' home and living there under rocket attacks and red alarms, and he wakes up in the night with heart-piercing cries of why do they get to live and my parents don't? But he still isn't calling for killing them all of them, all Palestinians, all Arabs, all Muslims, or terrorists. No, there's an absolute rejection of vengeance and a refusal to hate. That doesn't mean one doesn't seek justice. That doesn't mean one closes the mind to the crimes or turns the other cheek. And it doesn't mean that they don't understand that when they go back to their home eventually, that it'll only be under conditions where they are not going to be murdered in their homes by their neighbors who crossed over. There was a tower that the Hamas built a couple hundred meters down from the kibbutz across the field. And so they could see every morning, it was right across from the little path that Debbie and Shlomi lived on, and that the Holocaust survivor lived on with his aide, and that their neighbors who were murdered lived on. Adi, who also was 7-year-old orphan from both her parents. They knew exactly who they were going to murder. They knew exactly who they targeted. They would see Rotem get up every morning at 5 or 6 a.m. and walk his dog Marco. So this was premeditated and intentional, and that can't be forgiven, and that can't repeat, never again. But that doesn't mean that the actions that we take should be led from our gut, or should be acts of vengeance and acts of hateful violence. They have to be effective in achieving the end and the aim of allowing us to live here in safety and security, and making sure that whatever arrangements there are, we have people to talk to on the other side who can ensure and enforce the same on their population without our intervention. Now, is this going to happen tomorrow? Clearly not. Do I think it's easy? No. Am I aware that this idea that it's just individuals, there are only some people who are evil, but the rest of the civilian population is pure? No. I mean, we've seen evidence that that isn't the case. But having said that, what future do we have if we can't offer the imagination and a pathway to change that? And we have to persevere with our values. I'll tell you something. I know I'm going on at length, but I think that many people in Israel have used the term, we've woken up. Hitpakachnu. Our eyes have been opened. And we no longer believe what we believed. I think it's certainly the case that our sense of security, our trust in our government, our trust in the army, our sense of our position in the world, and the legitimacy that we thought Israel enjoyed, which has been called into, all sorts of things have been called into question. On October 7th, Shabbat morning, Simchat Torah morning, we woke up at 6:30 with the sirens in our house in central Israel. We ran down to our bomb shelter. We being myself, my wife, my children, my aunt who was staying with us for the holiday. And we thought, okay, it's another one of these attacks. They're harassing us. We'll wait until the all clear sounds and go up. And Deborah was actually the first one to contact us and say, are you okay? We see that there are sirens in your area as well. And as it turned out, 4 rockets fell around our house within a couple hundred meters, taking down one of our neighbors' houses. So it wasn't normal at all. And slowly she reported that they were hearing gunshots in the kibbutz and glass was breaking, and we were all very fearful for them. She wrote she was afraid for Shir and Shaka, who were in their own youth studio apartments, each one alone. And very soon afterwards, Rotem wrote on the family group, Mom and Dad are dead, sorry. And the shock of being with my own children, his cousins who are his age, to realizing that as parents, we can't promise to keep them safe, and that we can't always be there for them. And that saying that suddenly became not necessarily true. We went up. It took until roughly 7:30, 8 o'clock at night till we found out that Shir and Shaked were alive because their cellular connectivity had dropped out, and we didn't know if Rotem was the only one alive. We knew that Shaka and Shlomi were already dead. So after Shabbat left, and we got a call saying they were being evacuated too, and Rotem was being taken into emergency surgery. He was shot through my sister, or through the bed that she lay on top of him, hiding him, shielding him from the grenade and the gunfire. He was shot in the abdomen, but luckily it stopped short of hitting any vital organs. And after all this, we went upstairs, and I decided, the first response was, thank God they're alive. The children have survived. We have someone left. And the next thought was, what God? How could any benevolent God let this happen? I'm not a theological person, but I decided we maintain observance of rituals like Havdalah. And so I said a special Havdalah, and my son Rafi looked at me and said, Dad, it's okay. You don't have to be strong for us. So all of that unsettling and everything since that we've learned about our myriad failures and the failure of our government to take responsibility is extremely disconcerting. And it may change our evaluation of the practical steps that might be necessary and might be possible or feasible to head in the right direction of some kind of resolution. But it doesn't change the compass. In Hebrew, the word is matzpen and matzpun. The North Star is also our conscience. Our conscience and our values don't have to change. Someone murdered my family doesn't mean that I'm going to become a murderer too. It doesn't justify a shift, a fundamental tectonic shift in my basic values. It may mean that this world is more dangerous than I thought it was, and make me more concerned about what steps I need to take, including all the moral dilemmas involved in those steps of prioritizing my safety and justice over my enemies, until such a time that we can recognize each other and figure out a way that we don't come to blows. Not necessarily accepting everyone's narrative or view of history. But that's the fundamental. That doesn't have to change. And perhaps to illustrate this, I'll go back to their home in Holit after they murdered them in their safe room, which was Rotem's bedroom, and he lay under my sister, and they laughed and set fire to the house. And the smoke came up, and he had to extricate himself, and he bandaged himself because he was bleeding, and he survived alone for hours and hours. And they came back in, and he hid again, and eventually he was rescued and evacuated. But we went down to the home, which had been burnt and charred. In fact, when he got to the hospital, he was black from soot, utterly blackened. And so we walked into their very, very small, modest little home. They had saved up for a couple of years to renovate their shower. They were not people of means. And they had just put in a new glass shower. And when you come into the house and turn to the right and spray it with gunfire, they sprayed the whole house, and they shot up the shower. So it was like, what? You can kill them, but why do you have to ruin the shower, right? There were shards of glass shattered on the floor, on the new tiled floor, and the soot, so these diamonds glowing in coal. And in the middle of this mess was a button lapel. Palestinian lives matter. And of course they still do. And would that the Hamas and Palestinian leadership were able to take responsibility and the same care for their population and well-being that would allow us to release the hostages, end the war, and come to terms.
Aron, thank you for everything. Really.
I hope that we can come back in better days and look back and see that some of the problems that we've identified and diagnosed also have found their resolution.
Amen. Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan. If you have any comments or questions about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Until next week, Shalom.